George W. Bush had been President of the United States for less than a year when the course of his tenure was transformed in a single morning. On September 11, 2001, as the sun rose into a clear blue sky, Bush found himself confronting the worst terrorist attack in American history. The nation watched as he learned of the attacks in a Florida classroom, a moment of dawning crisis. In the hours and days that followed, this relatively new president, born into one of America's prominent political families but still carving out his own legacy, became the face of a nation's grief and resolve. With a bullhorn in hand amid the rubble of Ground Zero, he promised a stunned country that those responsible would hear from all of us soon. It was a defining moment that would come to overshadow the rest of Bush's presidency and shape the era in which he governed. To understand how George W. Bush came to that moment of trial, one must trace the arc of his life and career from its roots. George Walker Bush was born on July 6, 1946, in New Haven, Connecticut, the first child of George Herbert Walker Bush and Barbara Pierce Bush. The Bush family legacy loomed large. His father would rise to serve as a congressman, ambassador, director of the CIA, and ultimately the 41st President of the United States. And his grandfather, Prescott Bush, was a U.S. Senator. Yet young George's early years were spent far from the corridors of East Coast power. When he was a toddler, the family moved to West Texas, where his father entered the oil business. George W. Bush grew up in Midland, Texas, in the 1950s, a dusty oil town where his boyhood was more about Little League, baseball, and neighborhood mischief than political privilege. The Bush household was loving but disciplined, imbued with a strong sense of public service and faith. His parents taught him the value of personal responsibility and compassion, a theme Bush would later call compassionate conservatism in his own political rhetoric. As a teenager, Bush attended Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, an elite boarding school where he was an average student and a bit of a class clown, known for his easygoing charm more than academic prowess. Following in his father's footsteps, he went on to Yale University, graduating in 1968 with a degree in history. At Yale, Bush was popular among his peers, a fraternity president and even a head cheerleader, but he was not particularly distinguished scholastically. He later joked about his middling grades, saying he learned enough to get by. After Yale, with the Vietnam War raging, Bush joined the Texas Air National Guard in 1968, training as a fighter pilot. He served stateside and did not see combat, a decision that spared him the dangers of war, but later invited scrutiny about whether family connections helped him avoid a Vietnam deployment. In the early 1970s, Bush returned to civilian life and ventured into the oil industry back in Texas, much like his father had done. He also continued his education, earning a Master of Business Administration from Harvard Business School in 1975, making him the first U.S. president to hold an MBA. Yet through these years, Bush struggled to find a clear direction. He dabbled in various business ventures, starting an oil exploration company that achieved only modest success. More troublingly, he developed a reputation for youthful recklessness, especially when it came to alcohol. By his own account, Bush spent much of his 20s and early 30s living in what he later called an irresponsible youth, a period marked by hard partying and aimless periods of drift. Friends saw in him a gregarious, fun-loving character who had not yet discovered his purpose in life. A turning point in Bush's personal journey came shortly after he met a young schoolteacher and librarian from Texas named Laura Welch. They married in 1977 when Bush was 31, and Laura's steady, gentle presence had a calming influence on him. That same year, encouraged by his family and inspired by his lineage, Bush decided to dip a toe into electoral politics, running for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives from West Texas. He campaigned energetically, but his opponent, a popular Democratic incumbent, painted Bush as out of touch with the rural district, and Bush lost the election. It was a humbling defeat, and Bush returned to the oil business, experiencing both the booms and busts typical of the industry. In 1981, George and Laura welcomed twin daughters, Barbara and Jenna, marking a joyous new chapter in his personal life. Still, the shadow of his reckless habits lingered. In 1986, on the eve of his 40th birthday, Bush reached a personal crisis point. After an especially rowdy night, he woke up with a crushing hangover and a crushing sense of clarity that his drinking was jeopardizing his family and future. In a dramatic and deeply personal decision, he swore off alcohol entirely. Bolstered by a renewed Christian faith, he had a heart-to-heart chat with the Reverend Billy Graham around that time, which he credits with strengthening his spiritual resolve. Bush embraced sobriety and a more purposeful path. This transformation became a bedrock of Bush's adult identity, a born-again Christian and a man who had learned from mistakes, gaining a sense of mission and discipline that would soon propel him back into public life. By the late 1980s, Bush was carving out both a business niche and a supportive role in his family's political dynasty. He used his passion for sports and his network of investors to purchase the Texas Rangers baseball team in 1989. As a managing partner, Bush became a familiar face in the stands at Arlington Stadium, chatting with fans and enjoying the everyman camaraderie of baseball. The venture not only raised Bush's profile in Texas, but also proved financially rewarding when the team was sold years later. Meanwhile, Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, served as president from 1989 to 1993. The younger Bush watched and learned lessons from his father's leadership on the world stage, from the coalition victory in the Gulf War to the careful diplomacy at the end of the Cold War. Though George W. Bush largely stayed out of the policy fray in Washington, preferring to forge his own path back in Texas, that path was about to turn decisively toward politics again. In 1994, George W. Bush decided to run for governor of Texas, challenging the popular incumbent Democrat Ann Richards. Many observers were skeptical that Junior, as detractors snidely called him, could step out of his father's long shadow and appeal to Texans on his own merits. But Bush campaigned as a conservative with a common touch, emphasizing education reform, public safety, and a promise to restore integrity to the office. His folksy demeanor and fluent Texan style of speaking, peppered with nicknames and the cadences of West Texas, made him relatable to many voters. Bush's campaign also capitalized on Richards' missteps and the rightward shift in Texas politics. In a hard-fought election, Bush pulled off an upset victory. He was sworn in as governor of Texas in January 1995, marking the Bush family's return to elected office. As governor, George W. Bush surprised some skeptics by governing in a pragmatic, at times bipartisan fashion. He coined the term compassionate conservatism to describe his approach, conservative in principle, but concerned with using government to help improve lives. He reached across the aisle to work with the Democratic Lieutenant Governor, Bob Bullock, on issues like education and welfare reform. Education became one of Bush's signature priorities. He increased standards and accountability in Texas schools, pushing through measures to end so-called social promotion, moving children to the next grade regardless of performance, and to establish an annual testing system to measure school progress. These reforms, though contentious to some, boosted his reputation as an education reformer and would later form the blueprint for national policy. Bush also cut taxes at the state level and touted Texas's strong economy. Texas voters approved of the job he was doing. Bush won re-election in 1998 by a wide margin, even drawing a notable share of Latino voters, a growing demographic in the state. By now, George W. Bush had emerged from his father's shadow and built his own political brand. National Republicans began talking him up as a potential presidential candidate, impressed by his electoral success and his ability to connect with everyday citizens. At the turn of the millennium, the stage was set for George W. Bush to seek the highest office in the land. In the 2000 presidential race, Bush entered as a frontrunner for the Republican nomination. He presented himself as a different kind of Republican, one who was conservative but able to reach out to minorities and moderates. On the campaign trail, Bush often evoked his philosophy of compassionate conservatism, emphasizing education, a faith-based initiative to allow religious charities greater access to federal funds, and a humble foreign policy. If we are an arrogant nation, they'll resent us. If we're a humble nation, but strong, they'll welcome us, he said in one debate. He also promised a large across-the-board tax cut, arguing the federal surplus was the people's money and should be returned. After securing the GOP nomination, Bush faced Vice President Al Gore, the Democratic nominee, in the general election. the campaign was tight and tense. Bush's easygoing style and pledge to restore honor and dignity. To the White House, a clear reference to the Bill Clinton scandals appealed to many, while Gore's experience and command of policy details appealed to others. The philosophical differences were relatively modest by later standards. Both candidates were centrist in many ways, but the election would turn out to be one of the most dramatic in U.S. history. On election night in November 2000, the nation watched a roller coaster as the vote came down to Florida. Hours turned to days, as Florida's results seesawed within a razor-thin margin, triggering automatic recounts and a flurry of lawsuits. The outcome hung on a few hundred votes out of millions cast in that state. After a month of legal battles, including the U.S. Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in Bush versus Gore halting the recount, Bush prevailed in Florida by a mere 537 votes, thereby winning the Electoral College 271 to 266. He had lost the national popular vote by about 500,000, a fact that colored perceptions of his mandate. To his supporters, he was the legitimately elected president in a system designed by the Constitution. To some detractors, it felt like a presidency born in controversy and minority rule. Bush recognized the divisiveness of the election and in public struck conciliatory notes, promising to try to unite the country. But the narrowness of his win also meant the partisan atmosphere in Washington was tense from day one. George W. Bush was inaugurated on January 20, 2001, as the 43rd President of the United States. At 54 years old, with his wife Laura and twin daughters by his side, he took the oath administered by Chief Justice William Rehnquist, the sun breaking through clouds on the Capitol steps as he finished. In his inaugural address, Bush spoke of unity and responsibility, invoking American ideals of freedom and calling on a new generation to uphold them. He emphasized that while government cannot solve every problem, it can encourage individuals and communities to help their fellow citizens, reflecting his belief in volunteerism and faith-based initiatives. Bush's first months in office focused on domestic policy, much in line with his campaign pledges. He worked swiftly with the Republican-controlled Congress to pass a large tax cut. By June 2001, he signed a $1.35 trillion tax reduction, one of the biggest in history, which lowered income tax rates and sent rebate checks to many Americans. Conservatives applauded it as a fulfillment of promises and a spur for economic growth, while critics warned it might turn surpluses into deficits. Education reform also took center stage. Bush teamed up with an unlikely ally, liberal Senator Ted Kennedy, to craft the No Child Left Behind Act. This law, which Bush signed in early 2002 after months of negotiations, expanded the federal role in education by requiring states to regularly test students in reading and math and meet certain standards. Schools that failed to make adequate progress faced penalties. No Child Left Behind reflected Bush's belief in accountability in education and his willingness to work across the aisle. It garnered broad initial support, though over time its heavy emphasis on testing and federal mandates would face backlash from educators and some states. Still, at the outset of 2001, Bush's presidency seemed destined to be centered on domestic policy matters like taxes, schools, and a promised bipartisan attempt at immigration reform. Foreign affairs and national security were not the primary focus of the new administration until history intervened. In the summer of 2001, there were warning signs of threats abroad, but nothing that commanded front-page attention day after day. Then came September 11, 2001. That morning, 4 commercial airplanes were hijacked by 19 militants associated with the al-Qaeda terrorist network. 2 planes smashed into the Twin Towers of New York City's World Trade Center, causing the skyscrapers to collapse in a horrific cloud of fire and dust. Another plane tore into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A fourth, believed to be aimed at either the Capitol or the White House, crashed into a Pennsylvania field after passengers fought back against the hijackers. Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, visiting an elementary school to promote education, just after 9 a.m. As he sat in a classroom, listening to children read, White House Chief of Staff Andrew Cart stepped to the president's side and whispered the now famous words. A second plane hit the second tower, America is under attack. Cameras captured Bush's momentary look of shock and gravity as he digested the news. He remained composed in front of the students, but once out of the room, the presidency and the world had unmistakably changed. The hours after the 9/11 attacks were a blur of crisis management. Bush was rushed onto Air Force One and flown to secure bases as security officials struggled to piece together the scope of the threat. Communication was difficult. Fighter jets swarmed the skies. For a time, there were false reports, confusion, and fear of additional attacks. Against Secret Service advice, Bush insisted on returning to Washington that evening, determined to show that the government was still functioning. At 8:30 p.m., he addressed the nation from the Oval Office, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. He described the acts of mass murder that had occurred and vowed that America would not rest until the terrorists responsible were found and defeated. He reassured the stunned American people that the country was strong, and he urged unity in the face of the tragedy. His words, though brief, helped set a tone of resolve. In the days immediately following 9/11, something remarkable happened. A usually divided America came together. Grief and anger were accompanied by an outpouring of patriotism and solidarity. President Bush became a symbol of American strength and compassion during this period. He visited Ground Zero in New York on September 14th, standing on a pile of rubble next to firefighters and rescue workers who had been digging for survivors. Using a firefighter's bullhorn, he tried to speak to the crowd. When someone shouted, "We can't hear you," Bush famously responded, "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." Those spontaneous words brought roars of approval and tears to many eyes. In that moment, George W. Bush embodied the nation's defiance and resolve. His approval ratings, which had been around 50%, skyrocketed to nearly 90%, the highest ever recorded for a president. Americans, Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike, largely rallied behind him, giving Bush the broad support he needed to chart a response to the attacks. Bush's response unfolded on multiple fronts. Domestically, his administration and Congress moved swiftly to bolster homeland security and prevent another attack. Within weeks, Congress passed and Bush signed the USA Patriot Act, granting law enforcement and intelligence agencies expanded powers to surveil, detain, and prosecute suspected terrorists. The law, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in October 2001, lowered barriers between agencies like the CIA and FBI, allowed roving wiretaps and sneak and peek searches, and even gave the government authority to access personal records with minimal judicial oversight. Bush and his team argued such tools were vital in a fight against shadowy terrorist networks. Civil libertarians raised concerns that the Patriot Act went too far, threatening civil liberties and privacy. That debate would simmer for years, but in the fearful aftermath of 9/11, security took precedence for most. Bush also initiated the largest reorganization of the federal government in decades with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Announced in 2002 and officially established in 2003, this new cabinet department merged 22 agencies, from the Secret Service to the Coast Guard to Immigration and Naturalization, into one coordinated entity focused on preventing and responding to terrorist threats on U.S. soil. Additionally, Bush ordered the grounding of all civilian air traffic for days after 9/11, an unprecedented step, and then oversaw the tightening of airport screening and aviation security rules. Everyday life in America was visibly changed. Lines and metal detectors at airports, barricades around public buildings, color-coded terror alert levels became part of the national psyche. On the military front, President Bush set his sights on al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden, who was believed to be hiding in Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban regime. Bush made it clear that nations harboring terrorists would be treated no differently than the terrorists themselves. "Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists," he declared. With broad international sympathy and support, including from NATO, which invoked its mutual defense clause for the first time, saying an attack on the U.S. was an attack on all, Bush launched Operation Enduring Freedom in October 2001. U.S. airstrikes and special forces, together with Afghan anti-Taliban fighters on the ground, toppled the Taliban government within weeks. By early December, Kabul had fallen, and al-Qaeda's training camps were destroyed. Bush visited wounded soldiers, and in a poignant moment during his 2002 State of the Union address, he introduced the interim leader of a liberated Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, drawing bipartisan applause. However, Osama bin Laden and many top al-Qaeda operatives evaded capture, slipping into the rugged borderlands of Pakistan. The war in Afghanistan would continue in fits and starts, ultimately becoming America's longest war, a conflict that outlasted Bush's presidency by many years. But in the immediate period, Afghanistan was seen as a success. Al-Qaeda was on the run, and Bush's leadership was confident and sure-footed. Flushed with the initial victory in Afghanistan, Bush and his national security team soon turned their attention to a broader menace, the axis of evil, as Bush coined it. In his January 2002 State of the Union address, he warned of regimes that pursued weapons of mass destruction and sponsored terror: Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Of these, Iraq quickly became the focus. Saddam Hussein's dictatorship in Iraq had been a persistent thorn in America's side since the Gulf War of 1991. Iraq was under UN sanctions and no-fly zones, and Saddam had expelled weapons inspectors. The Bush administration argued that in the post-9/11 world, the risk of a hostile regime providing WMDs to terrorists was too great to ignore. They were convinced, based on flawed intelligence, it would turn out that Iraq was hiding chemical and biological weapons and possibly reconstituting a nuclear program. Throughout 2002, Bush and top officials like Vice President Dick Cheney, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and Secretary of State Colin Powell built a case for confronting Iraq, citing not just the WMD concern, but Saddam's defiance of UN resolutions and his brutal repression of the Iraqi people. In the fall of 2002, Congress authorized Bush to use force against Iraq if necessary. After an intense debate, the UN Security Council passed a resolution demanding Iraq readmit inspectors or face serious consequences. Inspections resumed, but their findings were inconclusive. Bush, impatient and not trusting Saddam's regime, was already moving military assets into place in the Gulf. He gave Saddam an ultimatum in March 2003: leave Iraq within 48 hours or face war. Saddam did not leave. On March 19, 2003, the U.S. and a coalition of allies, including Britain, Australia, and Poland, launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. In a televised address that evening, Bush announced that the operation to disarm Iraq and free its people had begun. The initial assault, a barrage of missiles and bombs on Baghdad known as Shock and Awe, lit up the night sky on television screens worldwide. U.S. ground forces raced from Kuwait toward Baghdad, slicing through the Iraqi defenses. Within 3 weeks, the Iraqi army had largely melted away. On April 9, 2003, the world witnessed the toppling of a large statue of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad's Firdos Square as Iraqis, helped by U.S. Marines and a tank tow cable, pulled it down. It seemed to symbolize a triumph of freedom over tyranny. President Bush, eager to herald a victory, landed on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln on May 1, 2003, piloting a Navy jet part of the way himself, donning a flight suit. He delivered a speech beneath a banner that read "Mission Accomplished." In the speech, he declared that major combat operations in Iraq had ended. Though he cautioned that difficult work remained, the spectacle of the day gave many Americans the impression that the war was basically over and won. However, the Iraq War was far from over. No stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction were found by the U.S. teams scouring the country, undermining the primary justification for the invasion. Meanwhile, a lethal insurgency was just beginning. Former Iraqi military officers, Sunni tribal fighters, Islamic extremists, including a new al-Qaeda branch in Iraq, and others who opposed the U.S. occupation, started launching attacks with IEDs, improvised explosive devices, suicide bombings, and guerrilla tactics. The new goal of U.S. forces shifted to counterinsurgency and nation-building, establishing security, rebuilding infrastructure, and nurturing a stable democratic government in Iraq. But the violence steadily escalated. American troops who had initially been greeted by some Iraqis as liberators soon found themselves targeted as occupiers. Sectarian tensions between Iraq's Shiite majority and Sunni minority, once held in check by Saddam's iron fist, exploded into vicious bloodshed after an especially provocative bombing of a Shiite shrine in 2006. By then, Iraq was teetering on the edge of civil war. For President Bush, Iraq became the central, consuming issue of his presidency. The conflict dragged on year after year, costing the lives of thousands of U.S. service members and tens of thousands of Iraqis, and costing the U.S. hundreds of billions of dollars. What had begun with a burst of confidence turned into a protracted, haunting conflict that deeply eroded Bush's public support and international standing. Even as the Iraq War proved far more challenging than expected, Bush's administration tackled other significant matters. In 2004, seeking re-election, Bush highlighted his leadership in the war on terror and the idea that he had kept America safe after 9/11. His Democratic opponent, Senator John Kerry, criticized Bush for the Iraq quagmire and accused him of diverting attention from al-Qaeda. The election was hard-fought. Bush's campaign also capitalized on cultural issues, appealing to conservative voters by emphasizing traditional values and supporting a proposed constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage, as a number of states had referendums on that issue driving turnout. In November 2004, amid a relatively smooth election compared to 2000's turmoil, Bush won a second term with 286 electoral votes and a margin of about 3 million in the popular vote. It was the first time since 1988 that a presidential candidate won a popular majority. Interpreting this victory as a mandate, Bush famously stated he had earned political capital and intended to spend it. With his second term underway in 2005, Bush set his sights on an ambitious domestic agenda. High on the list was reforming Social Security, the government pension program facing long-term financial challenges as the population aged. Bush proposed allowing younger workers to divert a portion of their Social Security taxes into private investment accounts, hoping to both give individuals more control and potentially a higher return, and to eventually reduce the system's burden on government. He embarked on a cross-country tour to promote what he called the ownership society. However, the idea met immediate resistance. Many Americans, including a large segment of seniors and Democrats in Congress, worried privatization would undermine the guaranteed safety net of Social Security and expose retirees to market risk. Even some Republicans were wary. Despite months of effort, Bush's plan failed to gain traction on Capitol Hill. By mid-2005, it was clear the proposal was effectively dead. Bush had spent considerable effort and political goodwill on Social Security reform and came up empty, a significant defeat. Meanwhile, fate dealt the Bush presidency another severe challenge. In late August 2005, Hurricane Katrina, a powerful Category 5 storm, roared across the Gulf of Mexico and slammed into the Gulf Coast. The city of New Orleans, protected by a system of levees, was especially vulnerable. When the levees failed under Katrina's storm surge, much of the city, especially poorer, mostly African-American neighborhoods, was catastrophically flooded. Hundreds of thousands were stranded without food, water, or sanitation. The disaster unfolded live on television, people on rooftops pleading for rescue, the overwhelmed Superdome turned shelter in squalid conditions, a city in chaos. The initial response from the federal government, particularly the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, was widely criticized as slow and inept. President Bush, in a decision that he later regretted, chose not to immediately visit New Orleans. Instead, he surveyed the damage from Air Force One, and a press photo of him peering down at the flooded city from the plane's window became an image to many of a detached leader. When Bush did visit, he praised FEMA Director Michael Brown. "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," at a time when, in fact, the relief effort was faltering badly. That phrase became infamous, shorthand for the administration's misjudgment of the situation. The Katrina debacle shattered the aura of competence that had been Bush's asset after 9/11. Americans across the political spectrum were dismayed that their government seemed unprepared for a disaster that, unlike a terrorist attack, had been foreseen by weather forecasts. The president's approval ratings, already weighed down by Iraq, fell further as television showed desperate Americans waiting days for help on his watch. Internationally, Bush's second term was marked by persistence amid turmoil. The situation in Iraq went from bad to worse by 2006 as violence peaked. The American public's patience wore thin. Disapproval of Bush's handling of the war climbed. The midterm elections in 2006 dealt a blow to Bush. Democrats won control of both the House and Senate, largely driven by anti-war sentiment and anger over Katrina and political scandals. In a move acknowledging the public's frustration, Bush replaced Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, an architect of the Iraq War strategy, with the more pragmatic Robert Gates. Then, Bush made a pivotal and controversial decision. Rather than begin withdrawing from Iraq, he ordered a surge of additional troops in early 2007, coupled with a new counterinsurgency strategy led by General David Petraeus. The goal was to quell the sectarian violence and give Iraqi leaders breathing room to reconcile. This troop surge met skepticism. Many saw it as throwing more lives into a failed war. But over the course of 2007 and into 2008, violence in Iraq did indeed drop substantially. U.S. forces, working with newly formed Sunni tribal militias, the Anbar Awakening, against al-Qaeda in Iraq, and a ceasefire by a key Shiite militia, helped dramatically reduce casualties. By mid-2008, Iraq was calmer, though still fragile. Bush's surge was credited with averting all-out civil war and allowing a tenuous stability to take hold, at least temporarily. It was a measure of vindication for Bush's unpopular determination to see things through, even if Iraq remained far from the functioning democracy he had once envisioned. The late Bush years also saw attention to other foreign challenges. A simmering nuclear crisis with North Korea, which tested a nuclear weapon in 2006, leading to multilateral negotiations. The ongoing effort to dismantle al-Qaeda. Bush's administration had some success arresting key figures, though bin Laden remained elusive, and addressing Iran's nuclear ambitions through sanctions and diplomacy. In 2007, Bush hosted an Annapolis conference aimed at reviving Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, though it made little lasting progress. He also championed humanitarian initiatives, like PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a multi-billion-dollar program launched in 2003 to fight HIV/AIDS, particularly in Africa. PEPFAR would become one of the most lauded aspects of his legacy, credited with saving millions of lives by providing AIDS treatment and prevention in hard-hit countries. On the home front, Bush's second-term domestic accomplishments were relatively limited, hampered by the Democratic Congress after 2006. He did achieve a significant revision of Medicare in 2003 before the midterms shift, adding a prescription drug benefit, Medicare Part D for seniors, which, though initially confusing in its rollout, became a popular addition to the social safety net. Bush also attempted a second run at immigration reform, a cause he believed in strongly as a compassionate conservative and a border state governor. In 2006 and 2007, he worked with a bipartisan coalition, including Senator John McCain and Senator Ted Kennedy, on a comprehensive plan that would tighten border security and provide a pathway to legal status for millions of undocumented immigrants. But a vocal backlash from conservative constituents, who decried the plan as amnesty, led many Republican lawmakers to withdraw support, and the effort collapsed in Congress. It was another major initiative where Bush saw opportunities slip away. One area Bush did leave a lasting imprint was the judiciary. During his presidency, he appointed 2 Supreme Court justices, John Roberts in 2005, elevating him to Chief Justice after Rehnquist's passing, and Samuel Alito in 2006, replacing the retiring Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. These appointments solidified a conservative tilt on the court. Roberts and Alito would go on to shape decisions on issues from campaign finance to gun rights to abortion in the years ahead. Beyond the Supreme Court, Bush appointed numerous federal judges, pushing the judiciary slightly rightward, a legacy Republicans celebrated. As 2008 dawned, an unforeseen crisis came to dominate the final stretch of Bush's presidency, a financial meltdown of epic proportions. Years of easy credit, reckless mortgage lending, and a housing price bubble culminated in a cascade of failures across the financial system. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers, a major Wall Street investment bank, collapsed into bankruptcy when no one would bail it out. Another giant, AIG, tottered on the edge and was rescued by the Federal Reserve. Credit markets froze worldwide. Banks stopped lending, even to each other, for fear of hidden bad debts. The stock market plunged. It became clear the U.S. was in the throes of the worst financial crisis since 1929, and it was spreading globally. President Bush, who had championed free markets and deregulation, now faced an ideologically unpalatable but seemingly unavoidable choice: intervene massively or risk an economic collapse that could rival the Great Depression. His Treasury Secretary, Henry Paulson, and Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke urgently briefed Bush and Congress, painting doomsday scenarios if the financial sector wasn't shored up. Though many conservatives recoiled at the idea of government bailouts, Bush threw his support behind an unprecedented intervention. In October 2008, after a tumultuous legislative journey, an initial House vote failed, sending stocks into a deeper spiral. Before a revised bill passed, Bush signed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, into law. TARP authorized $700 billion for the government to buy toxic assets from banks or inject capital into wobbly financial institutions. In practice, much of it was used to recapitalize banks to restore confidence and liquidity. The move was deeply unpopular. Average Americans saw it as a bailout for Wall Street fat cats who had caused the mess. Yet Bush believed it was necessary to prevent a total collapse of the economy. The crisis also spilled into the auto industry. By December 2008, GM and Chrysler were near bankruptcy as car sales plummeted. Bush, not wanting their collapse to add millions more to the unemployment rolls, extended emergency loans to them as a bridge until the next administration. These interventions arguably prevented an even worse catastrophe, but they stood in sharp contrast to Bush's free market rhetoric and added to a sense of disillusionment among the public. As 2009 approached, the United States was in a dark mood. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were ongoing. Though violence was down in Iraq, troops were still deployed in harm's way. The economy was officially in recession. Hundreds of thousands of jobs were being lost each month. Home foreclosures were rampant. Bush's approval ratings had sunk into the mid-20s%, near historic lows for any president. The hope and unity that followed 9/11 had long since evaporated, replaced by fatigue and frustration. Bush, ever aware of history, would later reflect that he would never be on a popular side of history during his time in office, but maintained that he made the tough decisions necessary to keep America safe and promote freedom. On January 20, 2009, George W. Bush welcomed Barack Obama to the White House and then quietly exited the national stage as the 44th president took over. In keeping with tradition, Bush did not publicly criticize his successor, choosing to fade into the background. He and Laura retired to Texas, where he took up painting as a hobby, depicting veterans and world leaders he'd known. Over time, some Americans came to view Bush more kindly, especially as the bitter divisions of later years made his era seem almost quaint by comparison. His personal decency, nobody doubted his love for country or his graciousness as a person, was often contrasted with the coarser tone of politics after him. Yet judgments on his presidency remained sharply divided. Supporters credit him with preventing another 9/11 scale attack on U.S. soil, with his HIV/AIDS program in Africa that saved lives, and with his principled leadership at a time of national crisis. Critics argue that his decision to invade Iraq was a grave strategic error built on false premises, that it diverted attention from the real enemy, al-Qaeda, and destabilized the Middle East. They fault his administration's use of torture on detainees, the expansion of executive power, and the swelling budget deficits from war spending and tax cuts. The 2008 financial crash, too, dented the legacy of Bush's stewardship of the economy. In the fullness of time, historians will continue to reassess George W. Bush's presidency. What is clear is that it was one of consequential events and decisions. He began as a self-styled uniter, not a divider, a domestic-minded president hoping to gently reform government with compassionate conservatism. Fate thrust upon him wars and crises that few could have predicted. In responding, Bush displayed courage and determination, but also at times hubris and miscalculation. His presidency saw moments of extraordinary national unity and moments of deep national discord. It profoundly altered America's trajectory in the early 21st century, in foreign policy, in security, and in the political landscape. Years later, George W. Bush himself reflected, "When the history books are written, someone will say, 'Where does George Bush stand in history?' I'm comfortable with the fact that it's going to take a while for the objective historians to figure out. Indeed, his place in history remains a subject of debate, but the story of George W. Bush, from the West Texas oil fields to the world's most powerful office, through triumphs and trials, is an indelible chapter in the American saga, one that will be studied and reconsidered for generations to come."
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat, her laugh still echoes in my bones. The saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain, where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, no